Привет.
Hello.
Servus.
Marhaba.
Hola.
Hello.
I'm inspired that there's so many people working to accomplish the same goal of creating a connected future.
By having students lead clubs on campus directly supported by Google developers, that's the best way to reach out to students.
It's really inspirational always to hear about members of the community who echo your values and echo your beliefs.
I've been listening more than I've been speaking, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because I'm just getting all these ideas.
Google, it needs to reach a wider audience and be more relatable as a company, and I think Google is one of the brands that is very good at doing that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Legal Insights for Student Entrepreneurs. My name is John Hoon Park, and I'm the club lead for the Google Developer Student Club at York University in Toronto. I will be your host for the next 3 episodes of our Legal Insights for Student Entrepreneurs series. Tonight, I'm very excited to bring our special guest speaker, Suresh Sriskandarajah. Suresh is a full-time business and technology lawyer at his own firm, Suresh Law, and he has a Juris Doctor from Osgoode Hall Law School, MBA from Wilfrid Laurier University, 2 bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and liberal studies at the University of Waterloo, with multiple co-op experiences at large tech firms like Amazon, NVIDIA, BlackBerry, and Microsoft. Now, we are live on YouTube and Facebook, so please ask away any questions you might have in the chat and share the link with your friends. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Suresh. Hello, Suresh, how are you?
Hello, John. How are you? I'm doing fine.
Good, thank you very much. Welcome to GDSA.
Thank you very much for having me.
No problem. Now, Suresh, let's start with your background. Can you tell us a little bit more about your academic and work experience?
I think you did a fantastic job there going through my entire LinkedIn or resume. But just to sum up what you said, I started off my career in engineering, working for large technology companies, and doing my own technology startups as well. And then went into to do my MBA and worked with startups to help them grow and succeed. From there, I realized that there's a lot of challenges that startups face when it comes to legal matters, and a lot of startups fail as a result of legal matters. So that's what led me to go into the legal direction, and I pursued a degree in law and became a practicing lawyer. But my passion for technology and startup remains. So I focus my area of practice to help entrepreneurs succeed in their journey by providing the right legal tools that they need. So most of my practice is working with entrepreneurs from the beginning of the ideation stage and helping throughout the entire journey of growth, and any legal assistance they need, I help with that. I'm a licensed lawyer in the province of Ontario in Canada. So a lot of what we're going to talk here is applicable to Ontario, but the general principles would be applicable elsewhere as well. Mm-hmm. And I also want to mention that it will be legal insights and legal information that I'll be sharing today. These are not legal advice, because that would be on a one-to-one basis that we would need to engage.
I see. So Suresh, you've been working in a variety of different fields. Could you tell me what motivated you to switch your careers from tech to law?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it was really working on my own startups, working for large technology companies. Then I went into business. So I was leading technology companies into the exits. So I was part of exiting a couple of different companies. So all of that from the initial stages, I saw a lot of companies fail. I saw a lot of struggles, and a lot of them had to do with the law. And even when it comes to M&A, when the company's trying to exit, people underestimate the amount of legal work that's involved, and sometimes entrepreneurs tend to oversee that. So that's what led me to start digging and learning more and more. And I eventually became very much interested in pursuing a degree in that. So I went on to become a lawyer. My passion was the technology law, so intellectual property and so on. So I focused that during my studies in law school.
I see. And what will we be talking about in mainly today, and what can students watching this take away from today's session?
Yeah, so today's, the series is about legal insights for student entrepreneurs. And this is whether students are thinking about doing a startup today, or what tools they should have in the back of their mind if they want to do a startup in the future. So that's what this whole 3-part series is about. Today is about the first stage, which is the ideation. So if you have an idea, how do you take that idea to market, essentially? What should you be thinking about? If you have a great idea you're working on while you're in school, what kind of legal what kind of legal framework you should be thinking about, what should you be careful about, what should you be doing right now is essentially what I want to share with student entrepreneurs so that they can have that as a tool. And that's what they will learn by the end of the session.
Awesome. Now, I just want to let you guys know that we also have a Discord channel set up that should be popping up right now on the screen. I want you guys to scroll all the way down to developers on the channel, and you'll see the Legal Insights for Student Entrepreneurs tab, and then you can ask any questions that you might have after and if, for example, if you thought of a good question, but you forgot to ask them in the chat, you can post these questions here, and Suresh will be answering them after the event. Now, without further ado, I'll pass on the mic to Suresh. Suresh, take it away.
Thank you again, John. So I do have some slides that I'll be walking through to present what I'm here to speak. But as I mentioned before, and as John mentioned, this is an interactive session. So feel free to ask any question. Feel free to interrupt. That will make it more interesting to be engaging. So ask any questions you might have in the chat in YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, and I'll get those questions and we'll be able to answer them as we go through the presentation. But for now, I'll get started off with the slides. So as I mentioned, today this series is called Legal Insights for Student Entrepreneurs, and we're doing the first part of it. Okay, so just a bit about myself, but we already spoke about that. In terms of my law path, started off in engineering, and I became a lawyer eventually by graduating from Osgoode Hall Law School. My areas of practice, so I run my own firm called Suresh Law, and what I focus on is helping entrepreneurs on the technology and corporate law side. So this is everything from incorporating or registering the business, structuring the business for the needs today and for the needs tomorrow as well in the future, and any shareholders agreement that would be needed, employment agreements, and if the startup is trying to grow and trying to raise money, how do you manage that and all the legal documents that are involved in that? And hopefully the startup does well and trying to do a mergers and acquisition and exit, and all the work that's involved where the lawyer needs to get involved is what I focus my attention on, is helping the entrepreneurs and startups from the beginning to the stages. So why is legal stuff, if we call it legal stuff, important for student entrepreneurs? So it's important for various things, and we sometimes overlook and neglect it. When you're trying to start up a business or operate it, it's essentially a part of it, like legal and technology and operations and sales and marketing all go hand in hand. So you need to take that into consideration to help you run the business smoothly and in various functions. Every department essentially has something to do with the law, whether it's sales and marketing or technology or human resources and so on. So it's very much a part of the company. So it's very important to understand that, to pay attention to that right from the beginning. And as a company grows, you want to try to avoid any disputes and any litigation. So for that purpose, it's a good idea to focus on put some importance on the legal aspect of your startup. And down the line, when the company is growing, investors, but also customers also ask for a lot of legal documents, whether it's contracts and how have you been managing a company from the moment it was established, or from the moment even beyond that, in terms of how the idea was formed, whose idea was it, who owns the intellectual properties. There's a lot of questions that investors would ask, and also customers will when they try to engage with you, you'll need to make sure confidentiality is maintained. So these are the kind of reasons why it's important to pay attention to the legal. And to think of a story of a company gone wrong, there's tons of stories I can think of, and I deal with a lot of clients where this is the case. But it all comes down to, if I can find a common theme about the story, is it goes on to two things. One is managing the expectations, managing the communications, and also paying enough attention to the legal element. So if you neglect the legal element of it and try to do things on your own without getting proper legal advice, many times down the road, you face obstacles, and you may need to try to undo the mistakes that were made, or it may entirely take the company down. So there's a lot of things, and a lot of this is not paying enough attention to the legal elements right at the beginning. So this is an important thing. You may be in school and be wondering, but I don't plan on doing a startup right now, but maybe in the future you may, and because you're involved in doing graduate research, for example, and how do you spin that off as a company later on? What should you be paying attention to? So when you're doing research and you want to take the research as a company, you want to think about the IP issues. By that, what I mean is, who owns the intellectual property of what you're working on? Is it the university? Is it you? Is it a team of you? So to make sure there is documents in place to prove that you own the intellectual property, because sometimes that could be a huge issue where you think you worked on it, but then the university or the other group members may own the IP as well. And if you're trying to create a company, there'll be a lot of obstacles you'll face. So when you're working on the research, it's important to make sure that you have documents in place to prove that you own the intellectual property, or whether it's a code that you've written, or a technology you developed, or anything like that. So it's a good practice to take on like patents and IP and talk to lawyers when it's applicable, and talk to lawyers to get the right advice on how to secure, how to protect your assets, essentially, right? So that's something important to keep in mind right from the get-go, even if you don't have immediate plans to start a company, because oftentimes down the line you may come back and say, hey, I own this IP, maybe I should turn that into a startup. So it's good to think about that even when you're doing research, even if you don't have immediate plans to do a startup right away. Now, what if I'm an undergraduate student? As an undergrad, I can remember myself, being focused on the schoolwork and the projects and exams, and you don't really have time to think about a startup. Well, actually, in my case, I was doing 4 different startups throughout my academic career, but most students don't have that luxury. But it is a good time for you to think about doing a startup, or at least taking the right steps to do startups in the future. So the basic steps you want to think about is, whether you're going to form a company now. There's side projects you can do as you can launch a project. So how will you register the company? How will you allocate the shares if you're trying to work with other people? Because when you're an undergrad student, oftentimes you're working with friends or group members and you're trying to launch a project. You want to make sure that the shares of the company you're creating are being allocated properly. And what kind of project are you working on that could potentially become a company? What's the structure of the project? How could that be turned into a company? Who will be on board? And then when we talk about NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, these are confidentiality agreements, essentially. What kind of NDAs or confidentiality agreement you want to have in place to make sure that your team members or others are not disclosing things to the outside people, releasing these secrets and confidential information that can hinder your startup down the line. So putting those kind of structures in place, even when you're doing a group project or working with friends, is a good thing to keep in mind. Whereas if you don't have the right framework in place, then you can run into problem later on when you're trying to do a startup. Or they may not be a problem right away, but once the company is doing well, there could be potential litigations over whose idea was it, who did what, and that causes all kinds of problems. So it's better to avoid it by having the right documents and structure in place, even when you're not as an undergrad working on a project. Okay, so now we'll go into the methods of incorporation. So how can you get your business incorporated? So in terms of incorporation, and this could vary from country to country since we have audience who are listening from other parts of the world as well. But the general framework, this is how it is in Ontario and many other parts of the world. So the general information will be the same. You can either register a company under your own name. In that case, you're carrying a lot of in Ontario, you carry a lot of personal liability. If anything goes wrong with the company, you can get sued at a personal level as well, or you can do a general partnership. A general partnership is when you form a partnership with the other entities or other people, and this is not a separate legal entity, it's a partnership agreement. Most people choose to do a corporation because a corporation will become a separate legal entity, and it will shield in most cases from personal liability. So any lawsuits or anything, you will be protected at a personal level. But in Ontario, for example, if you owe any taxes to the government, you won't be protected, or there's special type of corporations that are not protected as well. But in generally, that's what most people tend to go with. And if you're social entrepreneurs, because that's also something important, a lot of people work on social entrepreneurship, and they could be a separate structure you can follow, because in Ontario, you can register that as a not-for-profit organization. And it's still similar to a corporation, but the rules are slightly different. So that's also something to keep in mind, that which structure works best for you. And I know a lot of people tend to do this online on their own when they're trying to register a company, but it's good to speak to a lawyer to help understand what's the right strategy, what's the right fit for your needs today and in the future, so you can plan for the future by setting up the company properly right from the beginning. And just a reminder, you can feel free to submit any questions you have through the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. Do we have any questions that we should pause for right now, or should I keep going?
Suresh, I think we can keep going, but I'll definitely let you know if there are any questions.
Okay, perfect. I'll keep going. So choosing a company name, so that's also important, right? In Ontario, you can have a numbered corporation when you're registering, but most people choose to have a company name. So what are the issues, or what are the things to keep in mind when you're trying to pick a name? So you want to, depending on the jurisdiction you're in, you'll get a lawyer, or you can do on your own, to try to do a name search to see, when you think of 3 or 4 different names that you have in mind, do a name search to see what already exists out there, what trademarks may be under those names, and then the name should also help you get the right domain name, and also they should be distinct enough for your business that nobody else has something similar in your own jurisdiction in the same business as you. So you want to carefully pick your name, have a short list, and then do searches on that to make sure that nobody else in your jurisdiction has it, and no other trademarks are there. And a lawyer could help you do all that search to get the reports and explain what are the risks if you want to proceed with any names, or if everything is clear. So that's an important part of this journey as well. And then licenses and permits. So this is mainly, if you're using any third-party tools and you need permits. So if you're working on a technology and you're trying to integrate another third-party API or tools into your application, you want to make sure that you have the right licenses in place, right technology licenses in place to make sure that you're not breaching anything and there's no issues down the line, because you don't want to be in a position where you're working with your solution is incorporate somebody else's and you're not properly signed up in terms of agreement, and when the product is out there being marketed and sold, and you don't want to run into any issues where it could break down the entire question. Okay, so we have a question. John, please go ahead.
Hi, Suresh. So I have a lot of friends who are currently trying to, who have a lot of ideas that are in their undergrad and their graduate schools right now. And what they're wondering was that, if the project that they were working on was written in, for example, in SPSS, SAS, or in MATLAB, does it matter if their patents are in a certain language or a program that they don't necessarily own?
So, again, so these we would have to talk like on a case-by-case basis, but in general, the language, it doesn't matter. It's more about, what intellectual, like what code did you write, and what new things did you create, and to prove that you have created, or did you collaborate with somebody else? Now, what kind of IP rights do the other person have? So it's really about creating, and irrespective of the language that you're using, really.
I see. Thank you, Suresh.
You're welcome. Okay, we'll keep going. So now corporate and human resource documentations, and how that's important in the ideation process, and how to take your idea to the market. So when you're setting up a corporate record and the human resource information, there's a lot of contracts you need to have in place. You need to maintain all your corporate records. So it's not just about starting your company or registering it. Often people think that I incorporated my company, I'm good to go there. But no, you need to maintain records of all the important meetings. There's a lot of obligations you have as a corporation that to maintain the records, not just for tax purposes, but the government requires you, investors would require you, customers may ask of it. So that's something to keep in mind. And then human resource element of it, having the right contracts in place, knowing what kind of interview questions are prohibited by law in the jurisdiction you're in, because sometimes during the interview, we get carried away and ask questions that you're not supposed to ask. So being mindful and knowing what those are before you hire or interview a person is important. And then employment agreements and offer letters is also important, because if you run into any issues down the line and you want to terminate an employee, or you want to let go of a co-founder, you want to have the right employment agreements in place and offer letters in place that protects the intellectual property of the company, that protects the company in general, because the intellectual property is important for the smooth operation of the business. So that is something you want to keep in mind, and confidentiality again. So when you're hiring employees or contractors, putting in clauses or getting them to have a confidentiality agreement signed is important to protect the company, so they're not disclosing information outside. So these type of documentation is very crucial to smoothly running your business. And there's a question that's, what is an IP right? IP is intellectual property right. So this could be any technology rights that you own, but any code you have, or any core technology that you own, copyrights, trademarks, patents, all are part of IP. And these are different ways to protect something new that you created, or inventions you created that are fundamental to your business. So that's what essentially the IP rights are. Now, this is something a lot of startups are thinking about. How do you deal with investors in your company? Well, investors start off oftentimes as family and friends, and then at a later stage you'll have angel investors or venture capitalists. So this is if you can choose to get loans from banks, or you can choose to give up equity to get the funds that you need to grow your business, to start and grow your business. And it's important to understand what you're giving up in exchange for the investments that you're getting, or the loan you're getting. And it's important to identify what do you need and what are you willing to give up, how comfortable you are. And it's also important to think about having the right agreements in place to secure all of these investments, because you also want to think about who you're bringing on board, because as the company is growing, you want the structures to be correctly done in terms of how the shares are, so that future investors are not getting into any issues with that. So you want to think about how you're planning to grow the business, what are the future plans you have, and how should you structure the investments you're seeking today, and having a lawyer assist you with structuring the business according to that. So whether it's a loan, or you're getting investments from family, friends, and VCs, and so on. So this is, essentially in a nutshell, everything that you want to think about from the ideation, like how to take an idea to market. But at this point, I'm hoping there'll be more questions, and I'll be able to answer questions that you have. And feel free to put those in the chat, or feel free to put it in the chat or ask away, and I'll be happy to answer them.
So Suresh, I guess I do have a question. If I do not invent necessarily, but if I create some sort of a software, where does my right to my own software start?
Yeah, so actually, I'll back up a little bit before that.
Mm-hmm.
So to explain, on the corporate side, so when you had the idea, whether it's something you came up with on your own or as a group, and oftentimes you're working as a group, so there'll be like founders agreement that you would have in place before a company is incorporated, registered. Where you're talking about who owns what rights and who owns what technology and so on, right? Then when the company is registered, then you have shareholders agreement, and maybe I'll take a little bit of time to explain what that is. So when a company is incorporated, you're getting the company registration documents. In Ontario, it's called articles of incorporation. Then you're creating bylaws for the corporation. But another important document is called shareholders agreement. So shareholders agreement is essentially if you have multiple shareholders, what are the rights and duties the shareholders have? What is the job of the board of the company, the board of directors, and do you want to shift those responsibilities to the shareholders or officers in any way? All of that is done there. And then another question we're getting here is what rights does the university have if I were to invent something as a student? Well, it depends, right? And that's why you want to look into the jurisdiction you're in, and what rights the school has over the projects that you created. And oftentimes, if it's a research project, there'll be more rights the university will try to attach to that. But if you're a student working on a final year engineering project, for example, you get a lot more leeway there. So you want to look at the university policies on what rights you have versus the university having. Okay, there's more questions. That's good. In terms of equity, so equity essentially is how much shares you own in the company, because as this company is growing and you're bringing in more and more investors, you're giving up equity, which is the number of shares. That equity is what percentage, how much ownership you have in the company, and the shares will be number of shares the company has, and you will be giving up, issuing new shares and giving up the equity or the percentage of the company you own when you bring in more and more investors or even employees, because another thing to do is when you're hiring employees in the early stages, you may not be able to afford to pay them a lot of money, so you give up equity, so you're giving up a portion of the company in either shares or stock options in Ontario. So shares you're issuing now, or you can do vesting period as well, but stock option is based on the performance, where the employee or contractor would have the ability to purchase the shares of the company, but at today's value, but down the line. So for example, it's often common practice to have a 4-year vesting period for the stock option, so you meet the performance metrics that's assigned, you can buy shares at today's rate instead of a year later. So that's what that is.
Suresh, we have one more really good question here. Yeah. It says there, if I create a software package or an online service that sources information from a copyrighted online resource that they happen to find while they were researching it, is it legal to distribute it as long as it's for educational purpose?
That's a good question. Again, you'll have to check with the source. Sometimes just giving credit to them is good. Sometimes you would need to get permission from them or license at the right agreement from them in order to do that. And that's why it's important to check with the source and seeing if there's any agreement that needs to be in place. Because if you just verbally get the answer that it's okay to use, down the line as your product becomes successful, you might get into issues. So if you think it's something important, even if it's for educational purpose or fair use, if it's for commercial purposes, for personal use, you can often give credit, but for commercial purpose, it's good to have an agreement in place when you're using the third-party information, right? That other people own.
I see. And what would be different if the material that we were using was a free material? Do we have to give them still credit still?
Again, wherever you're getting the material, there would be policy in place that stipulates how it would work, whether you need to give credit or no credit, right? So it all depends on the platform or the forum you're getting this information from and what is the policy they have. And if you're not sure, you would ask. Like if it's open source, you would read up on what is the policy on what you're allowed to do, and there's a lot of leeway there on the open source for you to do what you like and improve. That's the whole idea, to have a community of developers to improve the technology by contributing to that, right? But there's still rules and guidelines on how to proceed, so you want to read up and be familiar with that. And if you need, you could even get a lawyer to help you understand that, right?
One more question, Suresh. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Social Network. That's about Mark Wahlberg and the conflict between the founders of Facebook. Suppose that we do have something really, really good, as good as Facebook, and we run into conflicts between our founders. Is there any general advice that you would give to students to avoid these kinds of matters?
I mean, I see, as a lawyer, I see all the time, including today, where there's conflicts between founders, conflicts between shareholders, conflicts between employee and the employer, and also important, conflicts between clients as well, and you, right? And it all comes down to oftentimes having the right agreements in place, so that all the different scenarios are stipulated, and what is each party's expectation, and what are we agreeing to, what is the rules, what are we agreeing in terms of our engagement as an employee, employer, co-founders, or as a client. And that will, when there's a disagreement, you can always go back to these agreements. If it's well drafted, if you take a general template and you just use it for just having it, it doesn't cover a lot of detailed scenarios. So it's important to have customized ones, so that whenever there's an issue, you can always go back to that to mitigate the risk. But it doesn't always eliminate it, because conflicts can arise no matter what. But if you have a proper agreement, you can try to resolve it by discussing and referring back to the agreement. But it comes down to communications and negotiating to resolve that, right? But otherwise, it will become a litigation, right? So, but having agreements could avoid it. And there's a question, So, and there's also a question. You can go ahead and read it.
Yeah. So, do you have any thoughts about the campus-based startup accelerators, and do you have any tips that you could share with us with your past experiences with them?
Yeah. So for sure. So in my engineering and when I was an MBA student, I worked with different incubators and accelerators, and I continue to. Even now, I'm part of 3 different incubators, but not campus-based. Actually, no, one of them is a campus-based accelerator. So I have a lot of experience with that, and I think these are great for student entrepreneurs, because they provide a lot of resources. But each one of them function differently, right? When they provide that service, they're either taking up equity, or they're charging a fee, or they may be doing it free, or they may be charging a monthly fee. So you need to be understanding what it is that you're giving up, or what it is you're paying, and what is the service you're receiving, and whether it's beneficial to you. And depending on the startup you're working on and the kind of campus accelerators you have, it could be very helpful for you. So because they'll connect you with the right mentors or the right advisors to help you succeed, and point you to the right even investors, right? So these are at the beginning stages. You may have an idea, you may not know how to develop the product, you may not have the right legal support, you may not have the financial support. So they give you all the go-to-market and all the different expertise that you need, and guide you through the process. So it's generally a good thing to leverage if you have the luxury having access to one, right? And my experience has been great, nothing but great, and then seeing so many startups thrive through starting off there, right?
Okay, well, that makes sense. One more question. What tips would you give a student who's about to graduate and from they've gained this a lot of experience from their co-op experiences and their internships, and they want to create a new startup, but then their ideas are borrowed or inspired from the companies that they've worked at. What advice would you give them if they were worried about stealing copyright IP ideas?
Yeah, so it goes back again to the agreement you had with the companies you worked at in terms of any confidentiality agreement or the IP agreements you would have signed when you worked there, and that would give you an understanding of what are the limitations of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do.
I see.
But if you're planning to go that route of leveraging the work experiences you had to do a startup and you're not sure after you have reviewed the agreements, it's a good time to speak to a lawyer, right? To see, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Here's what I've done in the past. Do you see any issues here? Am I okay to proceed with this idea? And then the lawyer will ask you the right questions, or even going to accelerators and places like this to get you the guidance and support to kind of brainstorm and see whether it's what you're trying to do is okay or not, right? But the first place would be check the agreements you signed with them. Number two, talk to a professional, whether it's a lawyer or the incubator at the accelerators, to see if somebody can give you a second opinion. But when you're doing that, again, you may want to have an NDA, or the non-disclosure agreement, so that the person giving you the advice, you don't need that for a lawyer because we're bound by professional obligation. But other people, if you're sharing your idea, you probably want to have an NDA signed by them before you start discussing the idea, right? So that they don't copy that and start on their own, but they don't disclose that. So that's the general insights that I would share.
I see. Well, thank you very much, Suresh.
You're welcome.
We have one more question in the chat. Would it be better to incorporate in the United States or in Canada, or is it more advantage to incorporate somewhere else? Because I asked that because we see sometimes startups like Y Combinator encourages their companies to actually be incorporated in Nevada. And do you know anything about that?
Yep, I don't know the specifics of that, but in terms of incorporating, you normally incorporating in the jurisdiction you want to operate. So even in Ontario, we, when a client comes to incorporate, we talk about whether you want to incorporate within the province or federally, and it comes down to where do you want to operate, where is your business going to operate, not necessarily where all the clients are going to be, but where is your core operations going to be. Now, the specific programs like Y Combinator, if they encourage you that, encourage you that, then there must be a reason. You can find out more, and we want to do the assessment to see whether it makes financial sense for you to incorporate in another jurisdiction, because you can always start in one jurisdiction to start your company, and you can always register the company in other jurisdictions later on as well, as your needs change and as your operations grow. And these have been great questions that you've all been asking, and I just encourage the audience to ask more questions. Put them in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. It could be anything related to taking an idea to market from the legal point of view. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have around that if I'm able to. So feel free to put that in the chat, and John will be able to read it, and I'll be able to help you with that.
Suresh, you mentioned that students should be aware of where they want to incorporate and where their main business area is. Would it be what would be the difference if they're a startup focused, worldwide? Or should they be, worried about technology laws in, for example, Korea, China, Japan, or in the UK?
Yeah. So there's a difference. So where is your business operations located and where are your offices located in? If that's in Ontario, and that's usually where you're going to incorporate. But if your clients are, for technology companies, would be all over the world, and that's a different thing. The example you provided of Korea would be applicable if you're trying to get clients there, or if you're trying to it protects your intellectual property there. So when it comes to registering patents and trademarks, you look at different jurisdictions of where you're trying to focus the growth of your business, right? It's hard to try to get protected in every jurisdiction right from the beginning because you don't know how your business is going to grow, and you also won't have the necessary resources, often case, right? So you have a plan in place at the beginning, and you do what you can at the beginning, and then at various steps you do more and more legal work as needed, right?
I see.
But yeah, the short answer is it's the operation of the business, where's the office, and not necessarily where the clients are going.
I see. We had a question in the chat. D-Muse, could you, sorry, I think you deleted that message. You can ask that later on. We have another question. It says, what should be in my operating agreement or bylaws?
Okay, so the bylaws so when the company gets created, you have the articles of incorporation that talks about who's the directors, where's the business address. So when you're incorporating in Ontario, you need to have a business address, you need to have the directors, the number of directors that are allowed, and what are the different classes of shares. So then you also create organizing documents after you're incorporated. And then one of the documents, and that is what you just asked, is the bylaws, and that talks about what are the different rules of governing the business. So that's what essentially the bylaw will be. That talks about what's the rules, the general rules that's going to apply to the business. And the other question actually it's there. It's let me read it out actually. So even though my idea is separate from his, is it somehow connected because it completes the full service package that I perceive? To him, his idea is already providing a full service. So I'm not sure if I correctly understand, but you're probably talking about collaborating with another person's idea and seeing if there's a part of the bigger picture of what you're trying to do. Anytime you have these kind of scenarios, essentially this is why you have that IP agreements to say who owns what in place. So if you have it in writing, it avoids any problems down the line. So if you can get an agreement in place to say what idea was yours, what IP was yours, versus your friends or co-founder, then that helps to eliminate obstacles. And this is a common issue, right? Like you have conflicts down the line saying, "Hey, it was my idea," or "I own this IP," versus you, and you run into this issue, right? So it's better to have things in writing right from the beginning.
Let's see. There was one more question. What should I be what should I be operating in? Let me read this question. What should be in my operating agreement or bylaws?
I just addressed
that.
Sorry. In terms of the bylaw.
Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, yeah. That's not the right. The other question was, if my business is operating fully online, will the local jurisdiction still apply?
Yeah. So a lot of businesses are fully online, and the jurisdiction applies in terms of where you would still have a register, like where you will be incorporating the business and where you'll be paying your taxes and where you'll be operating the business from. So no matter what, you'll be picking one jurisdiction to operate it from, and your needs will change. If you're trying to do business in other parts, if you're shipping something and so on, and your needs may change, and you may need to, for tax, you'll consult tax accountants or tax experts to see how you may need to restructure the business. But initially, even if it's fully operating online, you'll still have to pick a jurisdiction of where you want to register your business, where your head office is going to be. And when you pick that jurisdiction, it's going to have tax implications, it's going to have legal implications in terms of what are the rules, like the provincial laws governing incorporation is different than the federal laws in Canada, for example. So you want to get the advice from a lawyer to figure out what is the best fit for you, or what's the right choice for you based on your current business need, even if you're operating a fully online business.
I see. Thank you for that, Suresh.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
If there are any other questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. Don't be shy.
Okay. Anything about starting? Any? Maybe maybe I'll talk about some interesting stories from my experience and of working in technology, working in business, and also working as a lawyer. And one thing that is a common theme in these that's interesting is that we often think, even in law, that agreements is all what's written on paper that matters, but you got to pay attention to communicating and communicating with each other properly and having this open discussion because oftentimes, even if whether you have things in writing or not, if two people or two parties are not communicating properly and that they have a misunderstanding, that's what causes a lot of issues. So you want to focus on the human element. So even as a lawyer, I'm telling you to focus on the human element of always communicating, having records in place, having agreements in place, but focus on the human element. And this will avoid a lot of issues. And what are the priorities? Because you want to, even when you're doing a startup and you have a team, talk about what are the goals that each person has. How do you see the business growing? And spend time discussing, planning things, and making sure that your wishes and your goals are lining up. So, and then documenting that afterwards, and not just creating agreements for the sake of it. I work with a lot of companies. I have personally led companies to exit, as I told you. And in one particular case where I was leading a company to the exit, there is a disagreement in terms of the leadership over whether they should, which route they should take to exit and whether they should exit or not. And that conversation didn't take place properly, and we engaged in the exit strategy. So sometimes you don't want to rush into things. You want to take the time to properly communicate to make sure everybody's wishes are aligned. Because otherwise, when it comes down to the end part, when you're trying to sign any sale agreement, and if one party doesn't agree, then you get into chaos, and that could also ruin the relationship with the potential buyer, who you cannot go back to later. So I had that happen as well, right? Where going back was impossible, and then you got to find a new party. So as much as you can, having the good relationship with whether it's your co-founders and being aligned is important before you make any key decisions for a startup at the beginning, but also when you're trying to grow and exit. And this is why somebody asked about bylaws. Well, there's also resolutions and annual meetings the company is required to do. And having those kind of good practices will help you if you have a board meeting every year, for example, and you can make sure that you're still aligned on the same goals for the company and what are the major challenges. How will you be financing any growth and so on. So, try to be aligned as much as possible.
I see. We have one more question from Steve. Knowing that patents are quite expensive and very time processing, is there an alternative alternatives that young startup students can opt for?
Yes. So I was, for example, one thing is learning about the difference between patents, trademarks, industrial designs, copyright. What are the differences? And seeing what you're protected automatically from versus what you need to register for example, patents you need to register if you think you have something novel, right? And if you don't have, as a student, all the financial resources to do that. For example, when I was at Osgood Hall Law School as a law student, I was part of the IP clinic at the law school. So, and I was a fellow there. So what we do is we work with startups, often student entrepreneurs who are working on an idea, who want to patent something, and they don't have the resources to do it. So they come to this university-based or law school-based IP clinic, and we help them with the intake process and do a lot of it free of charge, besides a small administrative fee. And then there was big law firms who were partnered up with the law school, who had partners at the law firms providing their time and resources to assist. So exploring those kind of options would be good to see what's available at the universities or law schools that are around you, and then speaking to lawyers to see if because the law firms also have sometimes these clinics that can assist you, or even speaking with the lawyers to see if there's anything they can do for reduced rate or pro bono and so on. But being mindful of this is what they do for a living as well. So look for those kind of programs.
I see. The next question, should I require a protective angel or a venture capital investors to sign an NDA so that they don't steal my idea, or without appear rude or appearing smart?
This is a common practice to have an NDA, as I was mentioning before. So NDA is non-disclosure agreement. When you have a large client or a vendor or an investor, you almost always get them to sign an NDA so that they're not stealing your idea or disclosing it. So before you disclose the core of your secret sauce, you are usually signing an NDA, and people sometimes try to do their own or getting templates, but going to a lawyer and getting one drafted for what your business actually does and what's unique to you will make sure you have something customized that protects you. Because no point of wearing a helmet that doesn't protect you if you fall down and it breaks, right? So it's the same way. You want to have if you're using something, if you have a tool in place, such as an NDA, you want to make sure that it's actually going to be helpful to you if the need arises, and not something that's very basic that doesn't apply to your situation.
I see. Thank you. Suresh, are there any common pitfalls that tech startups usually fall into, and then anyone watching this series could watch this series and then try to avoid that obstacle?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of them, but from the legal point of view, there's two. Some entrepreneurs spend a lot of time thinking about what if this and what if that, and come up with every kind of legal things that they want to do ahead of time. Whereas other entrepreneurs just dive right into it without if there's any dive right into it without having any legal frameworks, legal documents, and both could be a problem because you want to balance the business needs, the go-to-market strategy with having the right legal documents in place. You can't do everything at once also. So just having a plan is important, but you don't need to necessarily do everything. But you do want to think about the important stuff to do that ahead of time. So if you neglect doing the legal, a lot of entrepreneurs pay a heavy price down the line.
I see. Thank
you.
you.
Since we're almost running out of time too, maybe I can share some key takeaways and some in terms of the legal insights to just kind of wrap up this session as well. For entrepreneurs, student entrepreneurs, if you're in school, you're working on a final year project or a research project or a group project, you may not want to necessarily start up right away, but you may do it later on. But you want to, in basically what I spoke today, is that you want to think about the possibility of potentially spinning off as a startup later on. So have the right agreements in place, think it through, especially if you own the IP, have the agreements in place. Get the resources, whether it's the corporate companies that are there or campus-based accelerators that are there. The university could have other programs, or the community could have other programs. So access the resources to learn more about potentially spinning off as an idea later on, but have things done properly and documented properly. And any question you have, speak to a lawyer as well if you have access to one.
Suresh, I hope you don't mind, but there's one more question in the chat. I think it's very good. What if the idea is talked over Zoom and the agreed conversation is confidential? Is it possible to issue an NDA?
Okay, so an NDA is signed usually before you disclose anything confidential, right? So whether it's over a Zoom meeting or whatnot, you normally get the parties to sign an NDA before you start to disclose confidential information, whether it's in person or over Zoom.
See.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that was the end of the questions.
Okay.
All right.
We can continue this conversation. So as you see there, you can join Discord, and there's a link that's provided. And after this session is done, I am on Discord, so I'll be happy to take any more questions and engage with the audience and continue to answer any questions on Discord. I am also on LinkedIn, and you can also go to my website, suresh.law. And this is a reminder that this is the first part of a 3-part series. So the legal insight for student entrepreneurs, there's 2 more parts to that. The next one will be on incorporation and organizing the company. So I look forward to meeting all of you in the next session. And that would be a great, it was a great conversation today and a lot of good questions. And I hope there'll be more questions as well again in the next session. And thank you again, John, for having me here. And thank you, Google Developer Student Clubs, for having me as a speaker. I really appreciate it. And feel free to, this session is also recorded and it will be on YouTube, LinkedIn, and so on, and Twitter and Facebook. So feel free to share that with your friends and invite your friends to the next session, because they can, whether you're working on a startup today or you have an idea down the line, it's good to learn this and have this as a tool to use when you need to. So feel free to invite your friends for the next session, and I look forward to meeting all of you again.
Thank you so much, Suresh, for taking your time to come have a talk with us. I'm sure there are lots of students who have a lot of great ideas in tech, but don't necessarily have the know-how in legal aspect to how to grow their idea into a startup. But now they know what legal things to look out for. All right, so that was the end of our session. Please join us on October 7th for the second iteration of our Legal Insight for Student Entrepreneur series. And as Suresh said, we'll be talking about different ideas and about incorporation of a company. Now, thank you very much, and we hope to see you on the second iteration of our episode.
Привет. Hello. Servus.
Marhaba.
Hola. Hello.
I'm inspired that there's so many people working to accomplish the same goal of creating a connected future.
By having students lead clubs on campus directly supported by Google developers, that's the best way to reach out to students.
It's really inspirational always to hear about members of the community who echo your values and echo your beliefs.
I've been listening more than I've been speaking, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because I'm just getting all these ideas.
Google, it needs to reach a wider audience and be more relatable as a company, and I think Google is one of the brands that is very good at doing that.